Hi everyone, thank you. So today's talk is called Lean UX Lessons Learned from 12 Projects. And in it I'm going to talk about what we've done as a company and what we've learned in applying our sort of process over and over again with lots of different clients. So 12 projects. And there's been a lot of variations in how we've gone about building out user experiences in those projects. So for putting together this deck and looking at our processes and what we've learned, I looked at 3 where we had the design provided. I've looked at 2 where we were updating the provided design, 2 where we worked with an external design agency, and then Wrangle-led upfront design, 3 other projects. And in some cases, some projects move through this almost in a life cycle because, as everyone knows, when you're working on software projects, you have an initial design, but as you start testing with users, you learn new things, you change direction. It's sort of the essence of the lean startup movement, and some went through a life cycle with respect to this. So at Wrangle, we started off as a development shop, so we have lots of development skill, and then as we grew, we moved into doing the design part of things as well, and we've evolved to a company now where our main sort of mission is to integrate design and development in a seamless manner in a frequent iterative development process. And that's ultimately where we try to get to, a rapid user experience design and iterative design through delivery. First, a few definitions, though, because this gets a little squirrely. What is Lean UX? What is UX? What does that all mean in the bigger picture? So the Lean UX fundamentally is an iterative design process where you're trying to do as little as possible to sort of create a design experiment where you get feedback. So this can be personas at the beginning. It can be interaction models. It can be prototypes, mock-ups, clickable prototypes. There's a lot of different ways of going about it, but you're trying to maximize your learning and have a validated learning approach. And it aims to use feedback and experiments to inform design, and it's extremely difficult to achieve. And there's a couple of key insights that I've gained over the last couple of years that I wanted to share. But before I do that, a few definitions. So, user experience ultimately is the experience the user has. So we have the user experience we're trying to do, and then we have the UX design, the practices of designing the user experience, and this is where some of the problems occur, whereas that becomes a separate design activity which gets separate from the implementation and delivery process. So you can think of it that you have UX design, which is the practices of designing the user experience, but you also have the practice of developing it. And when you're developing and delivering software and getting feedback, then you have this interesting dynamic where you're designing and developing sort of in real time, and you have to maximize communication. And what a lot of companies have started doing over the last few years is realizing that having a design group and a development group can be destructive, so they try to integrate them. And designers are part of the development team, because ultimately everybody is designing, everybody's adding value to the process. And at the intersection of these two, we're creating the final user experience. But some of the central problems, going back 50 years, the central issue with user experience is underestimating the effort and complexity of building usable software. So there's a couple of things here. One is understanding the user and what they really want. It's fairly well known now that users know what they want when they finally get it, and then they realize it's not what they want. Unless it's an extremely well-known field and you're building something that's incremental. So the other aspect of it is the effort required to build an amazing user experience is massive. And I think in the web world, people sort of think of the server as being the big deal, but it's not. It's the front end, it's the design, and right-sizing your sort of design effort in the project. So, as a rough rule of thumb, as we've sort of evolved and tested different sort of amounts of design and user experience work, we now look at it as about 1/3 of the project is the user experience work, 1/3 of it is the core application logic, and 1/3 of it's the front-end development. The big problem has never been a specialized lack of UX work. It's been a process that sort of teaches us and that we can learn from. And so Agile is interesting. User experience and Agile are somewhat at odds, and that's where Lean UX comes in. User experience is the primary reason Agile is important, because we can learn by delivering and getting feedback earlier. Yet we often treat it as a waterfall activity. There's a great explanation of Agile in a book called Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time, where it takes the Pareto principle, where you get 80% of the value for 20% of the effort. And if you think of what you do in an incremental Agile development model, is you do that first 20%. It's that ruthless prioritization of the most important 20%. You get the 80% of the value, and then you're getting feedback on that 80% of the value, so your next 20% is going to be the most important 20% again. So you're essentially eliminating, 50% of the wasted work that you would normally do because you're always focusing on the high value and having that drive the next high value things you work on. So balancing and coordinating the effort is the trick of getting an amazing user experience. Teams make this complex. Developers prioritize development, analysts prioritize requirements, designers prioritize design. We need to overcome this, and this is extremely hard to do. All three need to be integrated, and part of it's cultural, where people have come from, their outlook. Some people are used to working from, requirements, and that's all they want to do. Others want to engage and discuss. And so, we tried to build a culture where everybody is really into design, the developers, the designers are really into the development process, and everybody's collaborating effectively. But there's still a lot of challenges here. Agile arose because user behavior and needs, the user experience, are impossible to predict. But the modern user experience design process demands or implies a complete solution, gets a sign-off, and delivers software. So the key word here is implies. So there's a lot of great UX work that's done, and everybody's very open and very collaborative. But the problem is when you have a 50 or 100-page stack of documentation that was created any time in the past, when it comes time to discuss it, 2 months from now, and developers are reading it and other people are looking at it, the context is lost. So there must be a good reason for why things are the way they are. And if you open them up again, you start questioning everything again, and you end up doing the entire design process over again, which becomes very frustrating. And so the design documentation becomes the de facto standard almost out of necessity, if not just simply because nobody can remember why it got there and how it got there. And that brings us back to the old approach of building software with big upfront design, which is why we went to Agile methods in the first place, which makes me feel like this. This is destructive ultimately to a great user experience for social reasons, for process reasons. But the solution really isn't easy. It's very challenging. It's largely a culture thing. The hardest thing in software development is building teams that work together. And teams that work together remove a lot of waste and become very effective. So some of the lessons learned in applying UX in an Agile environment. So one of the things is any software documentation begets a waterfall process over time. And this is something that really occurred to me after working through a few projects. And I found that anything that was documented, that with any kind of amount of elapsed time from when it was documented, made it more and more sort of definitive, because the conversations were lost. And even if there was conversations, if that documentation wasn't destroyed or marked up or something was done to it, it would come back and it would pop up again. So there's a pixel-perfect design of a screen. There's a fundamental flaw with it. It's discussed. A change is made. And then, 2 months down the road, someone's pulling out that screen and saying, why doesn't it look like this? There was that loss of documentation there. Or what happens is people see this thing that was designed many months ago. The first half of the project's been implemented. The second half doesn't really follow the same sort of needs anymore. It doesn't have the same needs, but there's this really, expensive big stack of documentation that would have to be updated and changed. And once you've sort of finished that documentation, that was all built close to the conversations. And so now those conversations are in the past, and if you're going to have all those conversations again, you're really redoing the work, and that becomes extremely expensive. And so, fundamentally, any spec in time becomes a de facto authority and replaces conversations long lost once the software is being built. And that's what we need to avoid. That's how we have to architect our process and how we have to communicate with each other on the team and with our clients and with the market. Another way of putting it, design removed from conversation and validation suffers rapid entropy. So in a lean UX model, the goal is to design the user experience, work with the developers, everyone understands it, the client, work with some users, build it and release it as fast as possible, and then the software is going to stand in for the design, and you can incrementally work from that and not have to deal with a massive pile of documentation that would have to be constantly updated. But it's not even updating it. It's like the whole theory behind the documentation starts to erode after time as the sort of the learning that we're doing in the market starts to undermine a lot of the principles that we had in the original sort of conceiving of those documents. So we build products based upon misconceptions and misalignments, And this happens more and more as we work overtime on even a single project of a reasonable scope. So, what is the solution? We've sort of talked to it already, but shorten the link between work and validation. That's the key sort of takeaway. If you're going to build something, do the work to understand it, to plan it, to design it, and then build it and validate it, get everyone to buy in and sign off on it. And then the original documentation, was the original theory, was the hypothesis. It led to this phase of development, and everybody's happy, and we've got something, and everyone's signed off on it. There has to be that expectation that this is the life cycle that we're going through in building our user experience. Because otherwise, people are going to go back to that original documentation because they thought of it as a spec, even if they agreed that it was, really the initial idea or the hypothesis or the theory. So do way less of upfront UX so as not to create something that has apocryphal authority. Be very committed to treating upfront UX as a hypothesis. Treat code heavily used by your users as the final design authority. It's working, it's in the field, we have analytics, it's relevant to our initial theory. Partition your UX for different purposes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then ultimately define your user experience as a list of core values that your product abides by, not the specific solution. So the idea is not to have user experience as a set of prescriptive sort of things that people need to do, but a bunch of descriptive tenets and theories and values that you can share across design teams and still give them the freedom to deliver, get feedback, learn, and continuously update what's being built. And so for that, I started thinking about things as a lean UX lifecycle. So what happens when you're building a user experience? You want a good user experience, so you do user experience design. You want to plan for what the user wants, plan for what he finds important, design the interface based upon those practices, review those designs with users, get sign-off, and build and ship. That's the waterfall process, but it doesn't work very well for the reasons discussed. It's not that easy. As we said, users don't know what they want. You may not know who your users are, your product market fit. Actual usage versus stated usage tend to be very, very different. Like 80% of the features in most software are never used. Paper prototypes just don't work very well. Like you can have the most beautiful paper prototypes, but until people work with something in their hands, a couple of things that really affect that are data. So when you have real data and more data, that really impacts usability of things, the long lengths of lists and whatnot. I worked for a large enterprise software company many, many years ago that built a workflow system with a drop-down to select users. And everyone loved it, and they tested it, and they did no problem until they actually tried to deploy it at a large aerospace company. And the first person to click that thing had a drop-down with 3,000 users and an HTML page. And there was just no way to use it. They could have tried to think of everything like that, but getting out there, testing it, getting the feedback, and being able to change it quickly are really the most effective way of doing it. Unfortunately, their software development lifecycle was such that it would be months before they could ship another feature like that. So that's where a lot of continuous delivery and leaner methods come into play. That way you can learn and effectively take advantage of those learnings. So let's do some UX work, but let's not get too crazy, and let's realize that there's just some fundamental sociological effects of having documentation and having separate teams and having things get handed off over time. It impacts engagement, but it also just impacts how we can just discuss and question things. On that point, like just the discussions, like if it's been a couple of weeks, the discussions get awkward and people just stop having them because nobody remembers what the conversation was. There's just a lot of sort of negative forces at work. And so the solution is the lean UX lifecycle approach. And what's occurred to me working on a lot of different projects is one of the best ways to think about this as 4 different things across time, because you're often trying to solve different problems. So when you start off in a project, you're trying to figure out in the red box who your client is and what they want to do, and they have to figure it out themselves. It's almost psychotherapy in some respects. You're doing user experience design, you're walking through personas, making sure that you have a shared understanding, walking through scenarios. There's often an explosion of requirements. So people who come in who've done 6 months of planning and think they know exactly what they want to do, you bring in some other viewpoints, ask just a few questions, and all of a sudden things start spiraling out of control. There's so much to figure out. So you want to get the client research, but you want to get it sort of done quickly, and you want to just make sure you're moving in the right direction. So if you can agree upon a market hypothesis of where you want to go first. And so you put that aside. You don't get hung up on carrying that work forward because that was really exploratory. And now you start doing market research. You can narrow down on a certain few personas, a few processes, and what you want to do. So you start working through that, and now you're really narrowing your market down, and you might decide to go with only one or two personas. You might find out that your initial hypothesis was completely wrong. This is really helping you understand why you're going to build this product and why you want to invest in it. But again, those goals are rather different than actually building the product. This is really narrowing your focus again. And once you have clarity of what you want to do, you can move to the next stage in your user experience lifecycle. And that starts focusing on actual user research and user experience design, where you're trying to actually drive down to the fundamental interactions, look at the number of clicks, look at what the user wants to do, who they are, and start really designing the software. But even still then, you want to not get carried away carrying stuff over from the market research because that had a different goal. So you're now really working a very narrow focused hypothesis on what's going to work for that user. And once you have that figured out, now we're going to go into development and we're going to start testing it. And so that concept of narrowing the gap between the conversation and the validation is where we're working a really tight cycle here between the user research UX phase, the user experience design, and the user experience development, and making sure we can actually validate what we're building. And make sure that everything's fresh and all the tacit knowledge that came up in the conversations is all there to make sure that we can have meaningful, quick decisions without having to open up a can of worms every time we want to discuss a certain screen. So that concept of UX is client research. So I went over this already pretty quickly. We need to get into the client's mind. UX is amazingly valuable for discussing their motivations and inclinations. And you can figure out if market research is needed or if you can jump right into building. So it's a good, important first step, even if it's like an hour conversation, to make sure there's alignment here. UX is market research. So we don't even know our market. It's a new market. I mean, if you're building something that's worthwhile, it's generally you're creating a market. So you brainstorm about users and their ideas, wants, goals, and behaviors. We are doing market research. And if you try to think of this as being the definition of the software, you're going to try to really boil the ocean and define something that's too big. And there's just too much information there. It's not a narrow enough discussion. You're going to be building stuff that's for too many people, and it's going to be bloated and have too many features. This can be a lot more work than Lean UX because you really are trying to decide if you're going to go after this market. So you're going to spend a lot of money potentially building something. So you want to invest the time thinking about it. But the trap is to take that what you've invested thinking about it, carrying that forward, and then trying to build that because you're not close enough to the user yet. So treat it as a separate part of the life cycle and let it drive actual design. Once started a new Lean UX process, once oriented, start a new Lean UX process free to learn from delivery. And the result of this stage is a direction to yourself, to investors, to whether you want to put in the effort and whether you want to start building exactly where for what market. So UX is user research. We know nothing about the user, so we need to learn more. We need some aids to discuss the user. So we just have to have a methodology for understanding who the user is and what they want to do. We want some ideas about what they want. We want to point development in the right direction. We want a better starting point, but not a destination. And then finally, UX is a user hypothesis. Now we're getting closer to the actual concrete things we want to build. If we treat UX as a hypothesis, UX design, that's a good start. To do so, we need to age the original user experience work and stop referring to it as a source of authority. This requires design being everyone's job, including the developers, and ultimately owned by the user through validation. And so the sort of the gravitational pull or the authoritative pull of prior work tends to carry over into these different stages of the UX lifecycle, and that's profoundly costly because we're not learning, we're not focusing, and we want to make sure that we can move forward and get to the point where we really do have that Lean UX process where we're building out our design, building it, validating it, and doing that as quick as we can. And then finally, the actual user experience, where we're delivering software and we're validating it. So this is what we really want to get to. Any separation between conversations and design and validation of the software, that leads to design entropy and the risk of false authority. That concept of false authority and specifications, I think, is core, and one of the reasons that paper design doesn't work ultimately. There's just too much nuance and too much to be learned. Testing is often about closing the differences in perceptions for the people using the design artifacts, removing opinion. It's amazing how even with a team of 5 people, everybody really is seeing a different reality. Even after all these discussions and all this documentation, they all have their own worldview and they all frame the problem differently and they all think they're building something slightly different. Testing closes that gap. We're actually getting results directly back from the end user, and we remove opinion. And we need to find a way to highlight and emphasize the actual user experience. So we need to capture this. So a lot of the best design work is captured on the tail end of the process. We've built it, we've gotten feedback. That should somehow become part of our design documentation. And that's often completely ignored. That's the actual, real, fundamental experience, and that should inform our theory and our values and our core sort of UX model. So at Wrangle, we have a fairly simple lean UX process, and one of the things that we realized was that jumping right into it was a problem because we might not really be at that starting point. And so we would like to do less than a week of work in the user experience design and get to actually building and validating if we can. But if the market definition isn't there, then that's really hard to do. And we struggled with that, and then realized that this was really a separate phase. It was really understanding the client, was hopefully a quicker phase, and then the market definition. And this, in some cases, could be a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's not something that we usually do, but when it comes up, we do it. It really depends on where the project is in its life cycle. And there's a lot of value to be gathered from that. But even if that produces a beautiful set of documentation that really captures the market, we still want to treat it as a hypothesis, as a theory. And when we get to actually building the software, we want to focus again on the specific bits that we're building, discuss them, spec them, build, deliver, and be able to change them. One of the measures that we take is once we're actually building software, we should be able to make any change with a blank piece of paper and a pencil and quickly show it and get sign-off. There really isn't a need to go through a deeper evaluation or design phase unless we're really breaking out of our core assumptions. Interactive prototyping can be highly valuable. Static prototypes really fail, especially in the mobile space. Low-res mock-ups and a few high-res for overall design to make sure everyone's on the same page. But let's not over-invest in that. A lot of it's, where can you invest to get the best user experience? And ultimately, you want to invest in learning. And then a style guide. So the style guide is, talking about what's the output of this. What are the key assumptions? What's the playbook for your style, for your users? That becomes key. So steps 1 to 4 could be a day in a truly agile process, maybe a week. 2 weeks up front, and you should get a bit scared. It doesn't have to all be done up front. Learn something, design, build, and then learn some more. But once we've gone through that and we really understand what we're doing, then we can actually invest in development and develop working software for testing, refine with a pencil until it's clear, go back to 1, ship, or go back to 5. And sometimes do a complete restart. Like if you truly want to learn from the market and you really want to find the core great idea and the sort of the gut feel you have, and sometimes you want to go back to 0. But the key thing is here that the development cycle should be small and tight. Your sort of UX process should be, 1 to 4 should be quite lightweight. Could be a day, could be a week. But if you have more than that, then I would actually start thinking of that as really a market definition sort of process. To give a little idea about how we think of it in terms of an agile software development lifecycle, as we work through our design process, we have personas and requirements. We do our user experience design. We might have some requirements, documentation is needed. We do lo-fi mocks, some high. We might do HTML5 mock-ups. What we're seeing is lower clarity. We have like 10% or 0 clarity if they left. And then as we move through, we're getting like 50% clear on what we're going to do. But we're still changing things 40% of the time. There's a high churn. And what we want to do is a sense of where we're at before we start building is get to where we have, say, 70% clarity. And our change is going to be 10 to 20% over an iteration. So embrace actually writing stuff that you pull out. It's another sort of trap in agile development where you get so attached to the code that you've written, you never want to write stuff and pull it out. But if you truly are building things quickly that are complete features, you need to sort of have an affinity for assuming that maybe 10% of your code is going to be pulled out because it's really there to provide a complete feature. And if you never want to throw out code, you start creeping back into functional development where you're building really cathedrals and not really specific features that you want. And so that's just a sort of a sense, like intuitively, where you get to 70% clarity, you're having that rate of change, and now you can really start building stuff, delivering it, and getting feedback from clients. Another way of looking at it is from what's the lean UX design process, going through from domain knowledge to thinking about the design, the personas, the goals, the interactions, the prototypes, and then producing that UX architecture and style guide, which will be the sort of the guidelines, but not the prescriptive definition of like build exactly this, and then moving into iterative development and design refinement, and sort of being really clear and free to really learn and design and update your designs. So if you think of a UX lifecycle to align with Scrum, which is an Agile methodology that we use, you want to build a minimal viable product, and the idea is that when you're doing this, you need to take thin slices of your overall application. And so you're not trying to build functions and features and then build up to this UX design. And this approach that you see on the left is often what happens is because people feel everything's predefined, it feels prescriptive, so they'll start building from the ground up and laying out their functional features and making it reliable and usable and sort of pulling in the emotional sort of aspects of the user experience design. But we really want to understand enough of the problem, the persona, and the domain that we're actually building this, which is a complete feature that's usable and ultimately shippable. So as we get deeper into the product development lifecycle, we're shipping features to alpha testers, getting feedback, and really understanding the market a lot better. So that thin slicing. So part of the beginning of that is front-end style guides, a shift, and there has been a shift in the industry from prototypes to style guides, or full mock-ups. Some examples here, Bootstrap and CSS frameworks are a very low-level example of that. They have like a design language you can think in. Same concepts, different style guides. These sort of capture the essence of what the user experience goals are, without being, again, prescriptive. In the end, you want to document the user experiences. I think this is one of the biggest misses that we do, is we think we have it, we build it, we ship it, and there's all this knowledge that we will take as changes and tweaks, but we don't actually update our core assumptions and what our user experience is. So UX ultimately is the user experience of the end user, and the result of testing and capturing validated user experiences from delivered, heavily used code. This is often lost. You do A/B tests, which is split testing. You try two different things and see which one resonates better with users and analytics. And you have that, and you make some changes, but that really becomes, there's some great design concepts that could go into your style guides and your design sort of documentation. So create a UX document on the tail end of the validation process. Have all future conversations against this. Like this is part of what you're actually delivering as an experience. And outline the core values of your design and user experience and keep updating it. So some of the best practices to sort of summarize from the talk for achieving the lean UX success. Build close to the conversations around the features. I think that's the most important principle. Test and validate. Capture the core guiding assumptions and style guides and validated lessons learned. Don't fall into a waterfall trap by relying on documents that have no traceability or living context. I think somewhat that's almost impossible. I think that's almost impossible. Like all documentation ages, all discussions age. People have different perspectives, but you want to minimize that as much as possible. And then realize UX is about the user and the team's understanding of the user. Nothing exists without the other. And so you want to make sure that you're creating the knowledge and the practices that really maximize your team's understanding of the user and capture that user's feedback. So I got a little excited with the big audience. I went a little faster than usual. So if you have any questions, you can email me or find me on Twitter or give us a call. But at this point, I guess I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any questions. I don't know if we do that here. I can't really see, but I can see now. But anyone have any questions in the back there? Yeah, sure. So the average team size is, I'd say the team size is between 4 and 7. So the average team size is probably around 5. And the project length between 8 weeks and 24 weeks. So we typically do 3 to 4 month, length projects, some longer, but that's typically the case. Occasionally we will do 4-week projects, to really prove out a concept, and we've actually did a really interesting project in a couple of weeks once, but generally we're looking 3 to 4 months. To the point that there are some projects that, this won't really apply to. That's definitely the case. Some things are extremely well understood. One case is where people actually have an existing solution. So it's an interesting thing, actually. A lot of market innovations, I've noticed, come from people who've been in the market, and after a generation passes, all the complaints and all the issues are built up in that market, and they know exactly what they want to build, or close enough that they have a pretty clear picture. And so there's really a lot more informing that, and there's not as much learning to be done, though there's still a lot of value in doing that, because sometimes even just the ideas of how you interact with a particular sort of set of data isn't really known until you've tested it. Did that answer more or less? All right. Yes. So there's a couple, defining them, and usually we work with the client on that. So the client usually needs to bring that because that's sort of their realm. The way we normally do that is we treat the client as a customer right off the bat. So we try to follow a continuous delivery model. So by the end of the first sprint, we're delivering working software, and there's a website that they can go to with whatever documentation we need to guide them through it. For mobile, we use different ways of delivering mobile applications. One is we'll host it as a web app for easier access, but we'll also use things to distribute them to end users, and we'll build a list of testers. One of the important things, though, is that people are testing that you do want to sort of give them a process to gather feedback. So a good way of doing that is listing the things that you want them to give you feedback on, and then evaluating it, and then maybe following up again in multiple sort of phases. And a good way of doing that is to actually arrange conversations with the end users. Because if it's unguided, they'll use it, they'll give ad hoc feedback, but you're not going to get as much out of the learning that you'd otherwise get. Yes?
Have you had the opportunity to apply this to large projects? Because in my experience, this works for small projects, also small products that we're building.
Yeah.
For large projects, actually, this becomes a cycle.
Yeah.
Large features for large businesses. I'm not sure if you have.
We work generally on smaller projects, so we were a smaller company, so 5 to 7 people on a project. I have some experience working on larger projects, but it's challenging because often when you try to apply these principles on larger projects, it's not really even the scalability of the project, but the cultural challenge of actually changing an existing software development methodology. So one of the things that's helped us as a company is we were founded specifically to be a modern JavaScript Agile shop. So everyone who's joined our company has been on board with that and focused on that. But if you go into an existing software company, you could have like a large amount of, say, passive-aggressive behavior because people really aren't comfortable with working this way, and try to get a whole organization working in this kind of a process can take a couple of years. But there's been a lot of companies that have done that effectively. It just requires a huge investment, and it requires support right from the top of the company. So, yeah.
A lot of documentation. Do you speak to more specifically what goes into documentation of the software you guys use versus their end product for your documentation?
Sure. Yeah, so for most of the documentation is based upon what the need is in the project. So the way I look at it is if you have something that isn't captured, you need to document it. So the best thing to capture is the theory and the ideas, like the style guides. So we use Google Docs normally for that kind of stuff, so we can have multiple people collaborating on it. And we keep it fairly simple. We use Pivotal Tracker for managing our backlog, so we have user stories that we build against. User stories, though, are generally placeholders, they're pointers to conversations. If we're having a conversation the same day, the same week, and everybody's on board, we can build it and deliver it, and we can see that we're trusting that sort of implied documentation process is working because the client's getting the software and they're happy with it. If we're having these conversations and we won't be building it for, say, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, maybe because of the schedule of the client, we build it, bringing in some business domain experts, then we actually have to write specs because there's just no way we're losing too much information. So we sort of measure it from that. And then we'll use Google Docs and we'll write a spec, for that particular feature and link it into the user story. It's really just a question of, is everyone feeling comfortable they can build it? And not just now, but say, 6 weeks from now, if that's the case.
So do you guys get really detailed with your documentation, like results of like specifics of your A and B tests?
Not usually, but that's the direction that we're going in. And it's not just the specifics, but really, what was the design change, and we might note that we had run a test that was what drove that. So, any other questions? Oh, yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there, and do you have any kind of tips on mitigating that, or I guess kind of unifying those perspectives a little bit better?
Yeah, I think part of it, it's very hard to have those conversations if people haven't been working together. So having the team truly integrated and working together and having that, the term I like is information saturation. So everybody knows why things are being done a certain way. As soon as you have too much that's lost, then people are presenting stuff, but people don't really know where it's coming from or the meaning for it. Then the next thing is people have to trust the process. So once you have people communicating, you need to have a delivery process where people understand that this was ready to be built because this is what we did the last 5 weeks, and what we built was what we wanted to build, and they're trusting it. If it looks like that's not happening, that there was the conversation and things were built differently, it means that there's a communication gap. So you can look at getting the team working closer together. So it's the concept, the information saturation. You could look at maybe you just have the wrong team. Maybe you have to sort of tune the team. But it's the hardest thing, really, ultimately, is that communication. So it's either making sure that people are communicating, maximizing information saturation, and then having a delivery process that people learn to trust so they can let go and let things move on and start being built. Yes? So normally we work with a lot of clients who are very passionate, a lot of startups, so they come in with a lot of information. We work with them through a structured process to capture it, break it down, and see if it still holds up. And then if not, we look to talk with some of the users. But we're not a formal sort of UX shop, so we don't do a lot of the bigger UX projects where we would spend weeks doing user interviews, and we're more closer to the sort of the delivery side of things. So we usually start with clients after they have a pretty good idea of what they want to build. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah. 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 So the idea is you need to have enough confidence that you're not changing too much. So you're delivering a complete feature. You have an understanding what the feature is. You build it and you deliver it, and now it's released. The question at that point is, do you want to update that feature or not? If they do want to update it, that will often get prioritized at a lower level to a new feature, and it becomes part of the backlog. And so we're not going to just constantly get stuck on one feature and constantly redesign it. The bigger challenge is when building sort of complete working features. If people aren't used to doing that, it feels like they're doing a lot of work that's maybe not as optimal as how they're used to working. So if you're a developer and you need to build a object relational mapping solution, and you can just focus on that and build it to spec, you feel very productive. You're working 40 hours a week, and you're just cranking out code, and you feel great. The problem is how well aligned is that with the actual needs of the overall application. And so you're building a lot of stuff, but you maybe only need 20% of it. So when you build complete features that you test and document and deliver, you feel that maybe you're doing a little more work. The truth of it is you're actually not. They've done studies, especially in lean manufacturing, that when you're focused on one particular concept and you have everyone collaborating on it, it gets done faster because there's less task switching. You can get it documented, you can get the back end done, you can figure out what your test plan is. So there's a lot of, from a team perspective, there's a lot of productivity gains there. And then when it's complete, you get that feedback from the market. That's complete feedback, and that further optimizes the productivity of the team. But there is a challenge for people getting used to that, sort of working on smaller units of value and delivering that, sort of outside of the design side of it. But the idea is to get enough of a clear picture that you know you're going to build it and deliver it, and then maybe after you've gone for, say, your 3 months of development, you've got more feedback collected, and maybe you'll go back and refactor some of those features based upon design feedback, but you're not going to get too hung up on it in the near term. Yes?
Talking about those features that you work and you're actually implementing the design, have you had the opportunity to bring design thinking into the sprints?
Yes. Yeah, so by having a designer on the team in the stand-ups and committed to the project, it's happening during the sprint. And by having that, that's when you trust the process that you don't have to go to that level of detail before the sprints. And so you're finding the level of UX work that you have to do that will feed the process, where you have a really well-communicating team that can continue to refine incrementally the design. If there's too much of a gap, you really don't know what you're building, and you can't really estimate the sprint. But if you have enough clarity in the design and the design theory and the style guides, then that design thinking can inform the developers as they start doing particular features during the sprint. All right. I think we're pretty good then. So thank you, everyone.